Put the gun down. This is a funeral." The words didn't echo. They broke, like something fragile hitting marble, and for a moment, the entire cemetery seemed to forget how to breathe. A row of black sedans idled along the curved drive, engines humming low beneath a gray North Carolina sky, while the faint sound of a military bugle lingered in the air, stretched thin and trembling, as if even the music was unsure whether to continue. At the center of it all stood a man in a dark, pressed uniform, his back straight, his shoulders steady, his gaze fixed not on the officer in front of him, but on the flag-draped casket just 6 feet away. The officer's hand was firm, arm extended, posture rigid with authority, his badge catching a dull glint of light as it shifted with his breathing. Around them, mourners froze mid-step, mid-whisper, mid-tear. A woman clutching a folded program held it tighter, the paper crinkling softly in her grip. A young boy beside her looked up, confused, sensing tension he couldn't yet understand. The wind moved gently through the rows of white headstones, brushing past polished surfaces and pressed suits, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant rain. No one spoke. No one moved. The man in uniform did not flinch. His hands remained at his sides, fingers relaxed, not clenched, not raised, just still. There was something deliberate in that stillness, something practiced, like he had stood in moments heavier than this and learned long ago that dignity did not require motion. The officer's voice came again, sharper this time, cutting through the silence with a command that felt out of place among folded flags and bowed heads. "Step back. Now." But the man didn't step back. Instead, slowly, so slowly it almost felt like time itself was stretching to accommodate the movement. He lifted one hand, not toward the officer, not in defiance, but toward his own chest, fingers brushing lightly against the row of medals pinned over his heart. The metal caught the light in a quiet shimmer, gold and bronze reflecting something deeper than decoration, something earned, something carried. A ripple passed through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Eyes shifted, brows furrowed. Questions formed but stayed unspoken. Somewhere behind the line of mourners, a pair of dress shoes scraped softly against pavement, someone shifting their weight, unsure whether to intervene or remain still. The officer adjusted his stance, just slightly, as if the air itself had changed, as if something unseen had entered the space between them. But still, he did not lower his arm. The bugle had stopped now. Completely. What remained was silence, thick, pressing, alive. And in that silence, the man in uniform stood unmoved, his gaze never leaving the casket, as though the world around him, the weapon, the voices, the tension, were all distant echoes compared to the promise he had come here to keep. The man in uniform was not supposed to be the center of attention, not today, not here, and yet everything about him seemed to draw the eye in ways he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid, because Marcus Hayes had learned early that being seen was not always the same as being understood. He stood just to the right of the casket, exactly where the program had instructed family and close companions to stand, though there was no visible name tag, no introduction, nothing that announced who he was to the dozens gathered beneath the overcast sky. To most of them, he was simply a tall black man in a formal military dress uniform, his shoes polished to a quiet shine, his posture precise but not rigid, like someone who carried discipline not as a performance, but as a habit shaped over decades. His jacket sat perfectly across his shoulders, each seam aligned, each button fastened with care, and on the left side of his chest, a row of medals rested in quiet order, their surfaces catching fragments of light whenever the clouds shifted just enough to let the sun breathe through. He had arrived early, long before the first car rolled up the winding path, walking the final half-mile from the entrance gate instead of accepting the ride offered by a junior officer, because he needed those steps, needed the rhythm of gravel under his shoes, needed the time to let memory settle into something steady. The man in the casket had been more than a colleague, more than a fellow soldier, more than a name etched into official records and folded into speeches. He had been a voice in the dark during deployments when sleep came in fragments and silence carried too much weight, a presence that made distance from home feel survivable, a brother in every sense that mattered even if they did not share blood. Marcus had stood in deserts where the air burned at 110 degrees, had stood in briefing rooms where decisions carried consequences measured in lives, had stood in ceremonies where medals were handed out with words that never quite matched what had been endured, and through all of it, he had learned how to stand without drawing attention, how to exist within a system that did not always see him clearly, how to hold his ground without raising his voice. That same quiet discipline was with him now as he faced the casket, the folded flag resting at the head like a final promise kept, the edges sharp, the stars aligned in careful symmetry. He had not reached out to touch it yet, had not allowed himself that moment, because he understood the weight of it, understood that once his hand met that fabric, everything held in place behind his calm expression might shift. Around him, conversations had been soft, respectful, the kind that stayed just above a whisper, people sharing stories in fragments, recalling laughter, recalling service, recalling the small details that never made it into official reports. Some had glanced at Marcus with curiosity, others with quiet respect, but no one had approached him directly, as if something about his presence suggested both familiarity and distance at the same time. And then the officer had arrived, boots firm against the pavement, presence immediate, scanning, assessing, deciding. Marcus had noticed him the same way he noticed everything, not with alarm, not with suspicion, but with awareness shaped by years of reading rooms before speaking in them. He had seen the way the officer's gaze lingered a second too long, the way assumptions formed before questions were asked, the way posture shifted from routine to rigid control. And still, Marcus had not moved, because this moment was not about correction, not about confrontation, not about proving anything to anyone standing behind that extended arm. It was about the man in the casket, about the promise of showing up, about honoring a life that had stood beside his when it mattered most. So he remained where he was, 6 feet from the flag, feet planted, shoulders level, breath steady, allowing the tension to gather around him without letting it enter him, because some battles were not fought with movement, and some truths did not need to be spoken to be known. Officer Daniel Brooks had been on duty for just under 6 years, long enough to trust his instincts but not long enough to question where those instincts came from. And as he stood there with his arm extended, eyes locked forward, he told himself that everything he was doing was procedure, was awareness, was control. The cemetery, in his mind, was not just a place of mourning. It was a public space, a secured perimeter, an environment where anything unfamiliar needed to be assessed quickly and without hesitation. He had arrived 10 minutes after the service had begun, called in by a routine patrol rotation that flagged a high-profile military funeral in the area. And from the moment he stepped out of his cruiser, something about the scene had felt off to him, though he could not have explained exactly what that something was. The uniforms, the formation of chairs, the quiet order of it all, it was not the kind of setting he dealt with every day, and unfamiliarity, to him, translated into risk. His eyes moved in patterns he had practiced since the academy, scanning hands, scanning posture, scanning space, and when they landed on Marcus Hayes, they did not move away. There was no introduction, no context, no explanation offered to him in that moment. Only a figure who did not match what he expected to see standing that close to a casket draped in a flag, and that gap between expectation and reality became, in his mind, something that needed to be controlled. Brooks adjusted his footing slightly, the heel of his boot pressing into the pavement as he steadied himself, the weight of his responsibility settling into his chest like something heavy but familiar. He noticed the medals, but he did not read them. He noticed the uniform, but he did not recognize it. What he saw instead was a man who was not responding the way he expected, not stepping back, not speaking, not explaining, and that silence, to him, felt like resistance. Around him, the subtle movements of the crowd did not register as concern or confusion, but as background noise, secondary to the decision he believed he had already made. His training had taught him to act before hesitation could create danger, to assert control before uncertainty could grow, and so he held his position, firm, unyielding, his voice carrying again across the still air, sharper now, more insistent, as if volume could fill the gap where understanding should have been. I said step back. The words hung there, not as a request, but as a line drawn, one that he expected to be followed without question. But the man in front of him did not move, did not argue, did not comply, and in that stillness, something unfamiliar began to press against the edges of Brooks's certainty. It was not fear, not yet, but something closer to confusion, the kind that appears when a situation refuses to follow the script you have already written for it in your mind. He shifted his grip slightly, not tightening, not lowering, just adjusting, as if recalibrating without fully realizing it. The air felt heavier now, the silence no longer passive but active, pressing in from all sides, and somewhere behind him, he could sense movement, not aggressive, not chaotic, but purposeful, like someone stepping forward with intention. Still, Brooks did not turn, because turning would mean acknowledging that he might not have full control of the moment, and control was the one thing he believed he could not afford to lose. So he kept his focus forward, on Marcus Hayes, on the man who stood 6 feet from the casket and did not move, did not speak, did not break, and for the first time since he had raised his voice, Brooks felt something shift beneath the surface of his certainty, something small but undeniable, like a crack forming in glass that had always seemed unbreakable. Marcus Hayes finally moved, not in retreat, not in hesitation, but with a calm precision that carried the weight of years shaped by discipline rather than impulse, his hand still resting lightly over the metals on his chest, as if anchoring himself not to the moment unfolding around him, but to something deeper, something that could not be shaken by raised voices or misplaced authority. He drew in a slow breath, steady and measured, the kind that did not seek to control the room, but to remain centered within it. And then, with deliberate care, he straightened the edge of his jacket, smoothing the fabric across his torso as though preparing for inspection rather than confrontation. The movement was small, almost quiet, yet it shifted something in the air, something that even those standing at a distance could feel without fully understanding. A murmur passed through the gathered crowd, subtle at first, like wind brushing through leaves, but it carried with it a change in tone, a question that had not been present before. Why is he not reacting? Why is he not afraid? Marcus did not look at the officer. He did not acknowledge the extended arm or the command that still lingered between them. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the casket, on the flag folded with exact precision, on the memory of a man who had stood beside him in places far more uncertain than this. Slowly, he lifted his right hand, not upward in surrender, not outward in defense, but inward, toward his collar, adjusting it with the same care one might use before stepping onto a formal stage, ensuring that every detail reflected respect, not for himself, but for the moment he was standing in. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to pause, caught between motion and stillness. Somewhere to the left, a pair of uniformed service members shifted their stance, their eyes now fixed not on the officer, but on Marcus, recognition beginning to form not in words, but in posture, in the way they straightened almost instinctively, as if responding to something ingrained long before this day. Brooks noticed it, though he could not immediately explain it. The shift was subtle, but it disrupted the narrative he had built in his mind, the one where he was the central point of control, the one where compliance would follow command without question. Instead, what he saw now was something else, something quieter but far more grounded, a presence that did not challenge him directly yet refused to be defined by his assumptions. Marcus lowered his hand from his collar and, for the first time since the tension began, allowed his fingers to brush against the edge of the folded flag resting atop the casket. Just the slightest contact, a gesture so gentle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the entire space seemed to respond to it. It was not a claim, not an assertion, but a connection, a silent acknowledgement of the man beneath the fabric, of the bond that did not need to be spoken aloud. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition. Behind her, a man in a dark suit removed his hat slowly, holding it against his chest as if guided by instinct rather than instruction. The atmosphere was changing, not through force, not through volume, but through something far more powerful, something rooted in dignity that did not require validation. Brooks felt it now, unmistakably, a shift he could not control, could not command, could not fully understand. And for the first time since he had stepped into the scene, his certainty wavered in a way that no amount of training had prepared him for. His grip adjusted again, not tighter, not looser, just different, as if his body was beginning to respond to something his mind had yet to catch up with. He opened his mouth, perhaps to repeat the command, perhaps to reassert the authority he believed was slipping, but the words did not come as easily this time, caught somewhere between intention and doubt. And Marcus, still facing the casket, still grounded in the quiet purpose that had brought him there, did not rush, did not react, did not break the stillness that now spoke louder than any voice in the cemetery. The tension did not break all at once. It tightened, layer by layer, like a wire pulled too far, but not yet snapped. And in that fragile stretch of silence, every movement carried more weight than it should have. Every breath felt louder than it was. Officer Brooks took a step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, but deliberate. As if closing the distance would restore the control, he felt slipping through his fingers, his voice following a second later, firmer now, edged with something that sounded less like authority and more like insistence. You are not authorized to be here. Step away from the casket. The words landed harder this time, not because they were louder, but because they were spoken into a space that had already begun to reject them. A few heads turned sharply. Someone in the back whispered, too low to fully hear, but the tone carried concern, not agreement. Marcus Hayes did not respond. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge the statement as a challenge or an order. Instead, he let his hand rest for a moment longer against the flag, feeling the texture beneath his fingertips. The firm folds, the quiet weight of something that represented far more than ceremony. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hand and brought it back to his side, posture unchanged, expression steady, as if the moment unfolding around him existed on a different plane than the one he occupied. That stillness, that refusal to engage on the terms being forced upon him, began to ripple outward. A uniformed service member near the front row straightened fully now, his shoulders pulling back, his stance shifting from observer to something closer to readiness. Another followed. Then another. No words were exchanged, no commands given, but the alignment was unmistakable, a quiet line forming not through coordination, but through recognition. Brooks saw it. He could not ignore it now. The atmosphere had shifted beyond his control, the center of gravity no longer anchored to his voice or his stance. His jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign that the situation was no longer unfolding the way he had anticipated. He glanced briefly to his left, then back again, as if searching for confirmation that he was still in command of what was happening. But the faces he caught in that quick scan did not reflect compliance. They reflected hesitation, uncertainty, and in some cases, quiet disapproval. The sound of gravel crunching approached from behind, slow but steady, footsteps that did not rush, yet carried urgency in their rhythm. Brooks heard it this time. He could not block it out. It cut through the silence like a new variable entering an equation he had already solved. His focus flickered for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, the scene shifted again. Marcus remained where he was, grounded, composed, his presence unchanged, but around him, the energy had transformed into something unmistakable, something that no longer felt like a question of authority, but a question of truth. A voice came from behind Brooks, controlled but firm, not raised, not panicked, just certain. Officer. One word, and yet it carried more weight than the commands that had filled the space moments before. Brooks did not turn immediately. For a split second, he held his position, as if delaying the acknowledgement might somehow preserve what he had already asserted. But the footsteps continued, closer now, measured, confident. The voice came again, slightly nearer, still calm, still unwavering. You need to lower your arm. There was no anger in it, no threat, just clarity. Around them, the crowd had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that did not come from fear, but from anticipation, from the sense that something was about to be revealed, something that would redefine everything that had just happened. Brooks finally shifted, just enough to glance over his shoulder, not fully turning, not yet, but enough to register that he was no longer alone in this moment, that the narrative he had been operating within was no longer his to control. And in front of him, Marcus Hayes remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, steady, silent, and unshaken, as the weight of the moment continued to build towards something inevitable. Officer Brooks turned just enough this time to fully see who had stepped into the moment behind him, and what he saw did not match the assumptions he had been holding on to, not even close. The man standing there wore a dark blue dress uniform, pressed to perfection, the fabric sharp against his frame, every line deliberate, every detail precise, and unlike the quiet presence of Marcus Hayes, this man carried a visible authority that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood by those who recognized it. A silver insignia rested on his shoulders, catching the faint light breaking through the clouds, and beneath it, a row of decorations that spoke not in words, but in history, in service, in command. The man's expression was not angry, not confrontational, but it was firm in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. "Lower your arm, officer," he said again, and this time there was no ambiguity in the tone, no softness left to mistake for suggestion. It was not a request. It was an instruction grounded in something far deeper than local authority. Brooks felt it immediately, the shift from uncertainty to realization beginning to take form, though not yet fully accepted. His eyes moved quickly, taking in the uniform, the insignia, the posture, and then, almost involuntarily, they moved back to Marcus Hayes. For the first time, he really looked, not at the surface, not at the assumption, but at the details he had ignored. The metals were not random. They were aligned with intention. The cut of the uniform was not decorative. It was official. The stillness was not resistance. It was discipline. And suddenly, the space between what he thought he understood and what was actually in front of him collapsed in on itself. The air felt different now, heavier in a new way, not with tension, but with the weight of a truth that had been there from the beginning, waiting to be seen. Brooks's grip loosened slightly, not in surrender, but in recognition, the first physical sign that his internal narrative was beginning to fracture. Around them, the quiet alignment of the other service members became unmistakable. One by one, they had straightened fully, their posture shifting into formal attention, their focus no longer scattered but unified, directed not at the officer, but at Marcus Hayes. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it was undeniable. The message moved through the space without a single word spoken. Brooks noticed it. He could not ignore it now. His breath caught for a brief moment, subtle but real, as the realization pressed further into his awareness. He lowered his arms slowly, not abruptly, not with panic, but with the controlled movement of someone trying to regain composure in a moment that had already moved beyond his control. The gesture did not erase what had happened. It did not undo the tension that had filled the cemetery, but it marked the beginning of something else, something that could not be reversed. The man behind him stepped forward just enough to stand within Brooks's peripheral vision, his presence steady, unwavering. "You are addressing General Marcus Hayes," he said, each word clear, measured, final. There was no need for emphasis. The truth carried its own weight. The name settled into the space like a stone dropped into still water, the impact immediate, the ripples spreading outward through every person standing there. Brooks did not speak. He could not yet. His eyes moved once more to Marcus, to the man who had not turned, who had not reacted, who had stood in quiet dignity while everything around him unfolded. And in that moment, Brooks understood, not just the mistake he had made, but the magnitude of it, the way it had formed from assumption, from habit, from a failure to truly see. The cemetery remained silent, but it was no longer the same silence as before. This was different. This was the silence of recognition, of truth revealed, of a moment that could not be undone. And at the center of it all, Marcus Hayes stood unchanged, his presence steady, his purpose untouched, as if the world had finally caught up to something he had never needed to prove. The name did not fade after it was spoken. It lingered, settled, echoed in a way that reshaped the entire space without a single additional word. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that something irreversible had just taken place. Officer Brooks stood where he was, his arm now lowered, his posture no longer rigid with certainty, but held together by something far more fragile, something closer to awareness than control. His eyes remained on Marcus Hayes, but the way he looked had changed completely, no longer scanning, no longer assessing, but seeing, truly seeing, and that shift carried a weight he could not ignore. The man he had tried to remove from the moment was not just authorized to be there, he was central to it. woven into it in ways Brooks had failed to recognize. Around them, the alignment of the service members deepened, their posture firm, their presence unified, forming a quiet boundary that did not need to be enforced because it was understood. The man in the blue uniform stepped forward just slightly, not to take over, not to escalate, but to stand within the moment as it was meant to be, his gaze steady, his presence reinforcing what had already been revealed. Brooks swallowed again, the motion more visible this time, his breath no longer as controlled as it had been minutes before. The weight of what had happened began to settle into him, not all at once, but piece by piece, each realization connecting to the next, forming a clarity that left no room for denial. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to correct, but the words did not come easily, caught somewhere between intention and understanding. The silence around him did not rush to fill that gap. It allowed it to exist, to expand, to be felt. Marcus Hayes remained where he had always been, his attention still anchored to the casket, to the man he had come to honor, his presence unchanged by the revelation that had shifted everything else. Slowly, with the same measured control that had defined every movement he had made. Since the beginning, he took a single step forward, closing the small distance between himself and the flag. It was not a dramatic movement, not a reaction, but a continuation, as if nothing had interrupted the purpose that had brought him there. His hand lifted once more, steady, deliberate, and this time, it rested fully against the folded flag, palm flat, fingers relaxed, a gesture of connection, of farewell, of respect that did not require permission from anyone. The crowd responded without being told. Hats were removed, heads lowered, hands placed over hearts, the entire space realigning itself around the truth that had finally been acknowledged. Brooks felt it all, the shift, the weight, the meaning, and in that moment, he understood that what had happened could not be undone by a simple correction, that the impact of assumption carried consequences far beyond the moment it was made. He took a small step back, not out of fear, not out of command, but out of recognition, creating space where he had once tried to control it. The man in the blue uniform did not look at him again. He did not need to. The correction had already been made. The truth had already been spoken. And in the center of it all, Marcus Hayes stood in quiet dignity, his hand resting on the flag, his presence steady, his purpose fulfilled, as the ceremony, without announcement, without instruction, found its way back to where it had always been meant to be. The ceremony did not announce its return. It simply continued, as if the interruption had been absorbed into something larger, something steadier, and the bugle, after a long and patient silence, began again, its notes rising slowly into the open air, clear and unbroken, carrying across the rows of white headstones and into the quiet spaces between the people gathered there. Marcus Hayes did not move when the music resumed, his hand still resting against the folded flag, his posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he breathed, a quiet release, not of tension, but of something held with purpose that had now been honored. The wind moved gently again, brushing past his uniform, catching the edge of the flag for just a moment before letting it settle, and in that small motion, there was a sense of completion, not of the loss, but of the promise that had been kept. Around him, the mourners remained still, their attention no longer divided, their presence unified in a way that did not need to be directed. A woman in the front row lowered her head further, her shoulders rising with a slow breath, while the young boy beside her placed his small hand over his heart, mirroring the adults around him, learning something without being told. The man in the blue uniform stepped back into line, his role complete, his presence now part of the quiet structure that held the ceremony together. Officer Brooks stood at the edge of it all, no longer at the center, his position shifted not by force, but by understanding, his eyes lowered for a moment before lifting again, not to assert, but to witness. The weight of the moment remained with him, not as something sharp or immediate, but as something that would stay, something that would return in quiet reflections long after the day had ended. Marcus slowly lifted his hand from the flag, the movement measured, respectful, as if even that small separation required care, and then he brought his hand back to his side, his shoulders remaining straight, his gaze still forward. He did not look around. He did not seek acknowledgement. The moment was not about him. and he carried that truth with the same quiet strength that had guided him from the beginning. The honor guard stepped forward in perfect coordination, their movements precise, practiced, the folding of the flag carried out with a rhythm that spoke of tradition and memory, each motion deliberate, each pause meaningful. When the folded flag was finally lifted and turned, it was offered to the family with steady hands, a gesture that closed one chapter while honoring all that had come before it. Marcus stood just behind them, not in front, not apart, but present, exactly where he belonged. The sky above began to shift, the heavy gray softening as light pushed through in narrow beams, touching the ground in quiet patches that seemed almost intentional. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth had already been revealed. The moment had already been understood, and what remained was something quieter, something deeper, something that did not need words to be felt. Marcus took one final look at the casket, his expression calm, his eyes steady, and then, without hesitation, he turned and walked along the path he had come from, his steps even, his presence unchanged, leaving behind not silence, but something far more powerful, a stillness filled with dignity, with respect, and with the kind of strength that does not need to be seen to be known.